Hey, party people. I'm Lia Scholl, pastor of First Friends meeting in Greensboro, North Carolina. I hope you'll think about joining us sometime here in our beautiful meeting house. We meet with semi-programmed at 11 a.m. and we have an unprogrammed, that's the mostly silent service in Quakerism, unprogrammed at 9 a.m., 2100 West Friendly Avenue. Today we're talking about Saul and the Damascus Road in Acts chapter 9. And, I'm going to try to make the argument that Paul was a Quaker. So be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. This message was inspired by a Pendle Hill pamphlet I was reading this week, a pamphlet about how we come together each week for worship, and it struck me. The Apostle Paul was a Quaker. Let's look at the text. First, he requested letters to travel. Who does that? Quakers do. And then Paul was bathed in Scripture. There's this moment when Paul looks into the light of Christ and asks, "Who are you?" When we read that answer in English, it loses some of its oomph for a Jewish person. "I am Jesus" was the answer. But if you are steeped in the Hebrew Bible like Paul was, you hear it like this: Ego eimi, Jesus. I am Jesus. More like, I am Jesus. God calls God's self in the Hebrew Bible, I am. Or as the hymn says it, the great I am. Only one birthed and bathed of Scripture, in Scripture, would get that. And Paul definitely does. Then silence drops. Or maybe a better way to say it is that all those people walking there on the road to Damascus fell into a puddle of silence. The text says simply, the men with Saul stood speechless. And then Paul is told to wait for God's message. Do you see it? Paul is definitely a Quaker. We're talking about waiting worship here. And the vision of the Damascus Road isn't so much a story of salvation as it is a story of expectant worship. The Pendle Hill pamphlet I was reading is called 4 Doors to Meeting for Worship, and it's written by William Tabor. There's a couple of copies of the pamphlet in our church library, so feel free to check one out. It's number 306 in case you need it. In the introduction, Tabor writes, "Some people find it almost instantly when they attend their first friends meeting for worship. As they settle into the silence, they feel themselves gathered into a living presence, and they know they have come home at last. Others may experience their first Quaker worship as difficult and strange, but something keeps drawing them back until they gradually grow into a richer and richer experience of worship. And some people," he continues, "including lifelong Quakers, never seem to find it at all, sometimes turning away to other forms of worship, or sometimes staying dutifully and hopefully with the traditional Quaker form." But Paul got it. Paul got it fast. Tabor explains 4 entry points into worship, 4 doors he calls them, for the way that we enter for worship as Quakers. The first door he calls the door before. The door before is the way we enter into worship in our daily lives. If worship is, as Tabor relates it, a living stream we enter into, not a thing we do, but a state we enter, we can experience worship anytime. Tabor says, entering into worship often feels to me somewhat like entering into a stream, which, though invisible to our outward eye, feels just as real as does a stream of water when we step into it. The door before then is like dipping into that stream again and again, so that when we arrive, again and again during the week, so that when we arrive here for worship on Sunday, we're returning to a familiar reality which has been renewing and tenderizing us all week. That dip in the stream can be so many things. It can be reading our Bibles. It can be centering on God just before bed or in the early waking hours. It can be sitting in nature, experiencing the beauty of creation. It can be looking at art, listening to music, reading a poem, anything that can draw you into awe. Tabor suggests that we choose a simple, regular practice and persist in it, a spiritual practice. And that if we do, we'll find that Sunday meeting for worship more meaningful. He also suggests in your personal worship time, even saying a word, maybe reading scripture out loud or praying out loud, or maybe having a mantra. It's not magic or anything, but it's a tool for entering into worship. All along, we're cultivating our capacity to feel beauty and experience wonder. And finally, finding a spiritual friend who can travel that road with you is important. Maybe your spouse, your child, your next door neighbor, where you can share your worship experiences without being self-conscious. Now, the second door to meeting for worship is the door inward. I've read this query several times in different places. When does worship begin in the meeting room? And it's the answer is often, is it at the first note of the piano or organ? Is it when we finish the announcements? Tabor would say no. He says that most gathered meetings for worship actually begin long before the official starting time. The worship begins each time we focus on the meeting to come. We are already beginning the meeting. Perhaps we worship long before we enter this space, but we know that the door inward has been opened because we experience the presence of Jesus, of the light, when we walk in the door. And remember, it's not the space that's holy, it's the presence that is here in this space, whether we feel it or not. The door inward is actually kind of the hunkering down we do, settling ourselves into the presence. Tabor says that our chosen ritual of hunkering down will usually include a yearning to be in the presence, a focus or relaxed, alert attentiveness to that presence, and trust, or you may even say faith, trusting that it's okay to let go and rest in the living water of the stream. I wonder what practices you have to open the inward door. Do you remember that you are always already in the presence? Do you place your feet on the ground, hands in your lap, straighten your back and drop your shoulders? Do you repeat a familiar text like the 23rd Psalm or the Lord's Prayer, or perhaps a mantra? Do you pray, whether internally or for those around you, holding them in the light? Or do you visualize the presence? Just a reminder, worship is a practice, not a place we get. Sometimes it may feel like we didn't get there. Sometimes God is very close to us, and other times very far away. Remember that worship it's a marathon, not a sprint. And the cumulative effect of worship is a better measure of our being in the presence. It's a better measure than just how you're feeling today. And then there's a third door. And that third door is called the door within. Tabor explains the door within like this. An experienced friend can usually feel the difference when the door within is opened and will sense that the meeting is settled, gathered, or even covered. There is no outward signal or sudden burst of light which accompanies this deepening in the quality of the silence. If we even think about it at all, we just realize with quiet wonder that we have already been there for a few minutes. There are many ways of describing it when the door within opens. For some, it is like being lifted or expanded into another state of consciousness. For others, the mind slows and the time drifts away. For others, there may be an effortless flow of pictures, images across the mind. Others still may experience an effortless flow of logical thought, or maybe a review of the week about which God has something to teach us, or even just being drawn into an effortless flow of prayer. It always just reminds me that it is not work that I am doing in worship. It is work that God is doing through me. And it's not unusual that in this flow, we find ourselves confronting some unpleasant situation in our lives or becoming aware of something about ourselves which troubles or pains us. Sitting in the light means that unpleasant things can be revealed. We look at this as a time of growth, and it is during this flow that sometimes the message from a neighbor can feel like an intrusion. But we trust that those who are speaking into the center of the room, into the silence, are speaking with the voice of God, and that there may be a message for us, or maybe not. And if not, perhaps that message is for someone else, and we can just let it go. Finally, Tabor speaks of the fourth door, the door beyond. I have been in churches where there's a little sign on the front door that says, the mission field. So as you're walking out of the door, you are entering into the mission field. This oneness that we feel in worship is for us individually, and it is for us collectively. And ultimately, it is for the world too. Tabor says we may leave the hush of the meeting with a heightened sensitivity to the injustice, violence, and pain all around us. But fortunately, he continues, the same power which makes us more sensitive to evil and pain also makes us more open to an increasing awareness of beauty and spiritual resources which can enable us to be faithful followers of the way of Jesus, of which Jesus spoke. Imagine Paul coming to the place where Ananias has been sent. He and Ananias worship together, and scales fall off his eyes. Paul sees the world in a whole new way. Biblical scholar Willie James Jennings says that Paul's experience of worship on the Damascus Road, where a killer was confronted and stopped in his tracks, but equally powerful, the rationality for his murderous actions was shattered. There is no rationale for killing that remains intact in the presence of God. See, I told you, Paul is a Quaker. When we travel through that door beyond, we have a renewed openness to God and a greater faithfulness to work out in the world. This matters for us as individuals, for us collectively, and for those who are not gathered with us. As we become people soaked in the living waters, we are able to, at the very least, remember God more often in our daily lives. As we enter into waiting worship this morning, rather than a query, I would ask you to hold this gathered meeting in the light, remembering each face, each nook and cranny of the meeting house, and hold those who are hurting and those who are seeking, that they may slip into the presence, that they may fall into the puddles, that they can dive into the streams of living waters. I love you, and I love being your pastor.